And all right, we're recording here. Oh, I see us over here. All right, new interface, but faster, which is great. I'm gonna put that. All right.
Can we mute her? There we go.
You don't want to hear me twice?
The echo, that kind of throws my brain for a loop.
Was you were one of my early interviews. And I think at the time I hadn't yet figured out if I could mute. And so I just kept the other one really quiet and made the people I was interviewing deal with the double speak. Were we still doing that now?
Yes, we were doing that. I remember that well. Yeah, we rolled with it. It was okay.
We rolled with it.
Adapt. We didn't know how important at that time adapting would be.
And what a wonderful segue. So welcome everyone this week to So Ask Us. We are revisiting with Arielle Jessop, who was our resident artist and is now our artist friend.
Artist forever. Yeah,
friend forever.
Artist forever.
And what a great place to start with adapting. Arielle, how are you today, and how are you adapting today?
Excellent question. It's a daily, I ask myself daily, how am I today? It's a daily check-in. I'm all right. You know, we think about adapting. I'll give a little context for myself. I am a full-time graduate student in the art therapy and mental health counseling program at Springfield College. I started in person my graduate career and then shift to being full-time in graduate school during a pandemic when everything shifted to being online and being on Zoom. And I oscillate between, I can adapt, this is good for my neuroplasticity, we have to accept the things as they come to us, okay. And then I hate this, I hate being on Zoom, I can't learn this way, I can't connect with my teachers, no one's answering my emails, this is so disjointed, how am I gonna work with clients when I'm trying to learn this way, you know, and trying to have room for that, those feelings, and also remind myself that adapting is important. I have an incredible amount of privilege to be in school, to have a computer that works, to have a good internet connection that I can use, to be able to take out loans to go to school, and I'll deal with that later. So to really acknowledge my privilege and the resources that I have. And that's really helped. That's become a coping mechanism for me, along with yoga and meditation and eating right and exercising and trying to, you know, all of the self-care things. But that has really become a coping mechanism to really check myself. And that's helped when I go into those places of like total, like, you know, and it's like, you can't control this, you can't control what's happening here, but you can control your reaction to it, and reframe your thinking. So I say that like I've got this, and then there are days where that's out the window and I'm in tears and I hate everything, but that's a human response, I think.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So, and we're going to set up a few more acknowledgements for folks who are watching us today. So anyone who saw Arielle and my conversation a year ago, we had a really beautiful conversation, you know, about art, about being an artist, in the Valley, about connecting. And we've really come back together today, specifically to talk about your work with art therapy and starting down a path as an artist, kind of taking your art and shifting it into I don't know what to call it, a professionalized career path or what have you, but
Great.
Really,
let's call it that.
What?
I don't know what to call it either. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, right, because it fills a lot of niches, and I want to acknowledge a few things up front for folks who are watching. We are going to be talking about art therapy, inherently talking about trauma in a few different levels. So please just be mindful of yourself and your space and what you might need in virtually watching two people that you may or may not know talk about trauma. And also wanting to acknowledge, as you can see, that we are two white people talking about trauma, and we're aware of that. We're aware that we're coming at it with our perspectives, and even as we try and pull back with a wide lens, we are aware that there are limitations to our conversation today. So we want to acknowledge that up front. And lastly, wanting to acknowledge, because I think it will come up in our conversation today, that we are in a very particular moment, I think, of, or at least I'm feeling this, and I think Arielle is feeling this, of collectivized trauma and work around the verdict yesterday of George Floyd's murderer, Derek Chauvin, being found guilty on all charges. And so, as we delve into this conversation, I don't know that we'll delve that deeply into that happening specifically, but just that we're all in this context, in this moment, dealing with a lot of different kinds of trauma and traumas that, to your point, Arielle, about privilege, touch us all in different ways. So just to put all of that, front load all of that. And so anything you want to say about that before I dive into questions for you?
No, I think that's great. I think just acknowledging that we all experience trauma on different levels, and that there are different types of, I think we have to be careful when we talk about trauma, and really understand that there are differences, and that my experience of sort of what is happening in this moment in history is going to be different than a person of color's experience or a Black person experience of this, because I don't experience those traumas firsthand, and I am not affected on a daily basis, nor do I live in fear of the country or the state that I live in. And so I think it's just really important to acknowledge that. And I think it's going to continue to be important moving forward for white people to continue to acknowledge that, and their complacency in that, and how they are a part of a system that is starting to be, examined.
Yeah.
I would say that, I think that I'm grateful and pleased with the outcome of this trial. And I think it's important to also realize that, like, this is just the beginning of work that needs to continue being done. And that also, not to spend too much time on this, but it's sort of like the system that exists currently really is a well-oiled machine, and really knows when a conviction is needed, knows when a symbolic thing needs to happen. So it's a major step, and it's a big deal, and it's excellent. And it's also sort of just a stepping stone, I think, on a much larger, massive examination that is beginning to happen in this country, that I hope will continue.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing all of that into the conversation. I think I couldn't agree more. So let's, all of that acknowledged, I want to bring it back to you and to your work. And I think the first question that I would lead off with is, why art therapy? I mean, there are a lot of directions you could have taken. What was it for you in your experience that said, as an artist, this is something that I want to pursue further and be able to offer alongside just offering my work itself to the world? How did you start down this path?
That is an excellent question. And that is a question that I continue to ask myself. So I can give you my answer in this moment in time. Okay, how do I I'll start from the very beginning. I went to a Waldorf school. I grew up in a home where art was celebrated and used as a means of, which I didn't know at the time, affect regulation, using art to express myself when I was having really complex feelings. That was really celebrated when I grew up. I also grew up in a home with a mother who has a degree in specialization in child development. And also my larger family are mental health counselors and in the medical field on my mom's side mostly. So there was kind of a blending of those two things. When as a child, I had no idea that was happening. And as an adult, I can look back and be like, wow, like lucky me as a kid, because that is not something that a lot of people have access to or have the privilege to grow up in a home like that. So that kind of like set the foundation, I think, for me. You know, then I went to art school and I was like going to be an artist and I was going to be famous. And then I like moved to New York City, and then I was like pretty much just drunk for 8 years because I was like a bartender, you know, and I've had my own struggles with substance abuse and addiction. And so coming out of that period of my life and really acknowledging like, okay, those are real areas that I need to work on, and that's the path I could go down if I want to choose that path. Or I could not choose that path. And so I continued to make art and continued to be an artist. And while enjoying it, I always had this sort of nagging thing of like, this isn't it. Like, this isn't quite it for me. And I love making art and I love being in shows and being in group shows, but like, it was like something was like not, like it wasn't it. And I didn't know that art therapy was going to be it. I always have been really interested in the intersection of mental health and art. And I really wasn't until I like started volunteering and working with an organization when I still lived in New York, and then doing some art sessions with different organizations who were using art as supplemental services to their clients. And as I started doing more of that, it was like, oh, is this what art therapy is? Like, I think art therapy isn't new. Like it's been around since the 30s and 40s. I mean, depending on who like invented art therapy, but it's not a new thing. But like Edith Kramer and Margaret Nonberg are sort of like the pioneers of art therapy. But it is a new thing in like the more attention that it's getting. And as more, as anything sort of progresses and develops, there have been more studies done and more research done to gather more empirical evidence and evidence-based practice that really says, hey, this really works. And this really works in ways that other therapeutic modalities don't work. Not that they don't work ever, but in different ways. This is this taps into different things and can be really, really effective, incredibly healing. And so I started doing more research. I started reading more about art therapy. I went to a few conferences because there are like expressive arts therapy summits. And as I learned more about it, I was like, that's it. That's the thing. That's what I want to do. And so, I'm currently struggling with my identity of like artist, art therapist. How do I make work just about like my clients and, not about them, but my experience of doing that and vicarious trauma or whatever is happening? Or do I have an art practice and then an art therapy practice? What is the difference between those two? How do I have an identity here and an identity, but I think that is going to be an ongoing relationship and discussion that I have with myself. So
absolutely.
And also I'm a student. Like I am not an art therapist. I say full disclosure, I am not licensed. I am a graduate student in this field. So I'm in the process of figuring out what that is and what exact population I'm going to work with and what I'm going to do. I still have to write a thesis. That's later. So
next interview we'll talk about your thesis.
So I would say I'm still in the process of answering that question that you asked.
And to dig into, I'm always really fascinated, and especially as we come up on opening our local artist gallery in the Mill District, which is so exciting, and I will talk more about that. And one thing that you and I have talked about quite a bit is really having the space be experiential in the sense that it's not simply about artists showing and selling work, but really becoming a space where artists are able to access one another, access the community, and talk about the big picture of what it is to be an artist, how you support yourself, how you level up as art, with your art making as your livelihood, how you do different parts of the business side of things. A lot of artists need support with that. And all, yeah, right. And also, as you touch on all the different sort of career paths, identities, whatever we want to call them, that many artists find themselves sort of peering down. For me, I feel like I have a sort of similar story to yours, where I went to college for theater. I was going to pursue theater. That was my whole plan. And very quickly realized that I was a terrible auditioner and should probably find out something else to do. And though it took a while, eventually came to getting a master's in arts administration, because my interest was really more in the intersection of arts and business. And I think a lot of artists have this, whether it's one flashpoint moment or a lifetime of looking for, as you say, that like, what else is it about, this gift that I have that I don't feel like I've accessed fully. So when you're interacting with, other artists, or maybe at the gallery in the future, when we have an opportunity to have some sort of like roundtable discussion about how to, parlay our artwork into some sort of next step, what are things that you either find yourself saying to other artists or hearing from other artists about these moments of identifying the need to take a next step into something like art therapy, like arts administration, like consulting? I know that's really a broad question.
No, that is, I'm like, am I authorized to answer that question?
It's really, we're in this anecdotal space, I feel like, because I know that you've done a lot of, kind of searching around in yourself. Why art therapy? Why take this next step? And when it comes up with other artists, what do you find are there any sort of themes maybe that come up around trying to figure out that?
That's a really good question. Maybe I'm going to write my thesis. Maybe you just found my research. My thesis. I'm like, identifying themes. How do I do that? I think that's a really good question. I think that part of my sort of struggling with answering that is I think it is so personal.
Yeah.
Of how you, like, being an artist is really wonderful and joyful, and it also for me is really difficult. You are your advertising person, you're your PR person, you're your marketing person, you are your business person, you are your bookkeeper, you're your accountant, unless you outsource those things, and some people do. I don't have the money to pay everybody to do all those things except for website design, because it's for my mental health. I cannot. So I think that it's really, I hate the saying like, do what you love, because not everyone has the opportunity to do that. Everyone would love to be doing what they love, but sometimes we can't do that. So I think it's really getting in touch with, is my output the same as my input? Am I really getting what I really feel like in this one life that I have, in this incarnation, or whatever you believe, in this time that I am in this body? Am I really getting what I really want? For me, I was like, I'm an artist, and that was my identity, and I was really clinging to it. And then I was like, I'm clinging to this, but it's not me. That's not what I'm feeling that this is for me. And so that was where I was like, let's do some work on that. Let's think about this identity of, I am an artist. I am this. I have to be producing this. As soon as I was like, I have to, it was like,
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And so making the shift to art therapy for myself, like in my class, and there are times where I'm just like, I'm not cut out for this. I don't think I can do this.
Mm,
This is too much work. This is too hard.
yeah.
I don't know if I can handle the things that I'm hearing from clients, potential clients that I'm going to have. I don't know if I
Yeah.
can. And then I start working with people and making art with people. And it's like, so, uh, it's really beautiful to see how making art and accessing creativity helps people in phenomenal ways.
Mm,
So that for me is like, okay, those moments, this
yeah.
is what I want to do. This is solidifying this. I think for some people, they like, I have a friend, I hope it's okay if I shout her out, and some people may know Scout Cuomo in the Valley. And she and I had some conversations early on when I first moved back to the Valley about sort of next steps and what do we do. And she has taken it in a direction that I think feels really good for her, and where she like now has a gallery in Greenfield that she's running, and
Yeah.
she's starting in a consulting business to help other artists, to really help them figure out these
Yeah.
kinds of things. And so like that for her is something that is like fulfilling and really finding a way to like not only create your own art, but also give back, also connect to
Yeah.
people. Like art, being an artist, I think can be really connecting, and you're putting yourself out there. And also at times it can be kind of isolating.
Yeah.
And so I think, someone like Scout is like, okay, this is a way that I can get that sort of fulfillment that I want to do, that I want to be engaged with my community. For me, it's okay, this is what I really want to do. I really want to talk to people about mental health and art and expressing and accessing parts of our brain that our words can't access.
Mm,
For other people, it might be, I'm a web designer and I'm trained in web design. I really want to offer classes to people and, still make my own art, but I also want to teach, or I want to do an exchange. I don't want to, because some things are, the art world and certain things can be pretty inaccessible. Things are really
yeah.
expensive. And I think artists with each other have a really good practice of sort of sharing and caring, if you will.
Right.
In my experience anyway, in my arts community, like my studio is in Cottage Street in East Hampton, and everybody is always, hey, I have this, hey, I have that, hey, here's this opportunity. My studio mate is a bookbinder and runs her own business, but also works for other bookbinders in the same building. So they share projects and work together, and some of them are much older and have a lot more experience, and so then offer their expertise for projects that she's working on. So I think for me as an artist, it's really important to find those ways of connecting and learning from each other.
Yeah.
And just in an act of self-care, like talking about stuff.
Yes. Yes.
for
Right.
for lack of a more sort of
Yes. Getting it out into the
talking
collective
about stuff.
brain. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And
I don't think that answered your question at all, but that's where we
it's
landed.
okay. We're rolling. We're rolling with it because this is a big subject. And I, one of the things that I love about talking with you, and we're doing it now, is your willingness to talk while in the midst of something. I think, just to share a little bit of my experience, I'm someone who tends to think something all the way through before sort of engaging in talking about it, for fear of saying the wrong thing or what have you. And I think it's so important, as you say, you're still in the midst of school, you're like really in the thick of it, but continuing to think about it and think about the why and think about the future and think about all of the different pieces. And I mean, we haven't even gotten yet to the fact that after starting school, we all entered this global collective, I think a lot of people would use the word trauma, that we are all still in. Though there is hope and beautiful sunshine on the horizon around the pandemic, it's something that we've all experienced. And one thing that you just mentioned that I would love to hear more about, because to me, one of the big differences between sort of traditional therapy, also known as talk therapy, and art therapy is that very often art therapy is offering a space to and attempting to open up a space where words become less important, and it's accessing things that sometimes are sort of focused on verbalizing and the need to verbalize can't access. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit, when you mentioned nonverbal approaches, what is it about art therapy that you feel is getting at something that other forms of therapy can't get to sometimes?
Yeah, I can answer that in like a very narrow, that is a huge, like
I
there are still active research projects being done on that. So, I will answer that sort of in my own experience, but with the caveat that like, that is a massive thing. And there are books and articles and things that you can read from experts, which I am not yet in that. So I will just, that's my little disclosure there. Disclaimer. Yeah.
Disclaimer.
I think words are really important. And as we know, language matters a lot. How we refer to people, how we label people, how we phrase things. So I would say that words also matter in art therapy. Like there's writing and journal writing and poetry and creative writing therapy, and you can incorporate words in a really meaningful and intentional way in art therapy. Like art therapy isn't just painting and drawing. There's music and dance and writing and poetry, and all of that can be really impactful. I think because we rely so heavily on words, like we're doing it right now, we're having a conversation. It would be really challenging for me to like demonstrate this through interpretive dance, although that could be our next interview. I bet a lot more people would show up for that.
Don't promise things you're not ready for. We're experiential here. We got to try it.
I think that sometimes, I remember reading accounts of people who worked in the prison system doing art therapy and talking about how a lot of the clients that they were working with were sort of master manipulators of language. They knew exactly what to say to what therapist. They knew exactly what to say to check the box. I'm good. I can get out. I'm done.
Because they have to a certain extent.
Yeah. And they're mandated to be in therapy and they don't want to be there. And I will say that doesn't just happen in the prison system. Like there are a lot of mandated people who have to go to therapy who don't want to be there. And I think that art can tap into feelings and emotions and unconscious and subconscious things that exist. When we talk about trauma, we can even talk about pre-verbal things that happen, pre-verbal memories that happen that are there.
Yeah.
I think of like Bessel van der Kolk and The Body Keeps the Score, if anyone knows of that book, but read it if you want to read some more about trauma. I think art and other modalities as well as in talk therapy, but art therapy has a unique way to tap into emotional experiences, pre-verbal memories, emotional memories, somatic memories, in a way that talk therapy doesn't. And in a way, if we're thinking of doing that through a trauma-informed lens, in a way that can be slower and less re-traumatizing. It's not necessarily saying, okay, tell me your story with words, go back and tell me everything that happened to you. It's like, for someone who's been traumatized, that sometimes isn't an option. And so I think that art, and let's say I'm going to shift this to sort of like a wider lens. When I think about something like COVID-19, we're looking at a whole world of people who experienced something. And everyone is going to have a different emotional reaction to that based on their experience, their pre-existing experience, who they are, what they have, what their privileges, what their race is, what access they had to healthcare, what they didn't have. I mean, we know there were massive health disparities that came to light, things that have always existed, but that came to light with COVID-19. And so I think when I think about like, ooh, how do we talk about that? And I'm like, well, for me, as someone who's interested in art therapy, we make art about that, because that is, whether you're looking at art, viewing art, making art by yourself, making art collectively, it, for me, taps into a deeper sort of like, I just think of like the gesture of like, like of this emotional experience, where like, I'm pretty articulate. I could talk all day about stuff and it doesn't ever really go below here. Because I'm talking about it and I'm in my head and I'm making sense. And then when I really like go here, then I like experience sadness. I experience grief. I think about like things that are really difficult to think about and feel in my body. And making art has been a way for me to express feelings from there, express thoughts from there, and not just talk about them. I do the same thing in therapy with my therapist, like talk until I have to take a breath and sit down and like make a mark on the paper. Then I like burst into tears because it's like, oh, I was sort of intellectualizing this experience. And I wasn't able to really feel my sadness, feel my grief, feel, you know, whatever part down there. She's usually like 5 years old, is really upset, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, I think, that you go back to that 5-year-old self, or feel that 5-year-old self. And also at the beginning of this shared that, you know, you have some really early memories of art being available, right? Definitely. As a way, so that connection point kind of staying strong. And I'm curious how, I don't know exactly how to word this because this question is occurring to me in the moment, because you know, I feel like we live in a society where traditional forms of therapy, or even non-traditional forms, but largely non-art therapy forms of therapy are very available and very known, right? So when people are talking and anyone's like, maybe you should go to therapy, they're talking about talk therapy usually. How do people find or source for themselves maybe alternative forms of therapy like art therapy? Do you find it's still a sector that is sort of recommended once you're already in a therapeutic process? I feel like I don't hear it front loaded as like, oh, have you ever considered art therapy? Like outside of circles that are in the know already.
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure that I have all the information to answer that accurately. I would say that, you know, therapy I would first just say that like therapy is available, but I don't think it's always accessible. And I think that in certain communities, there are a lot of stigma around therapy. And just mental health in general. And so we think of therapy as available. I'll say personally, I think of therapy as always available and accessible, because I am white, middle class.
Yes, thank you for checking.
I am
so true.
You know, everything is available to me because that is just my sort of like delusion of white supremacy that I am complacent in, and I'm working to try to be more cognizant of that. But I think one thing that I'm learning as I go into this field is like, ooh, therapy is not really accessible. And it's something I think about when I go out into the field to work, is like, how do I have a model where this is accessible and affordable? Because as we know, healthcare and health insurance that doesn't mean anything is accessible or affordable. And so if I am to do that, then how do you get people to come to therapy? How do you know, and I think art therapy is definitely, like, this is just my sort of like experience of it and how I hear about it. Like play therapy, art therapy, things like that are really used in agencies. There are definitely art therapists in private practice. but they're used in hospitals. Like a teacher of
Mm.
mine is an art therapist at Yale Children's Hospital and Bridgeport Hospital and uses art therapy with kiddos in crisis or in the emergency care unit there. And some schools have art therapists. Like I think Mohawk Regional had actually, yeah, Sari Pace is art therapist there, has a
Wow.
art therapist, which is awesome. Art therapy works really well with adolescents in my experience. I mean, art therapy really works in my experience, but you know, there are resources like there's ATA, which is the American Art Therapy Association, their website. And I can email you some other resources if you want, Hannah, too. There are art therapy summit conferences that you can take. You don't have to be an art therapist to take them. You can just take them if you want. There's an organization in Northampton called Art and Soul, and they do groups that use some art therapy directives and modalities. But again, like it's not new, but it's definitely, and like I might get in trouble for saying this on Facebook Live, but I feel like, so get ready.
I'm ready.
Everyone's ears have like perked up. I feel like art therapy kind of has this like woo woo. I hate when people do that. And I just say it. I feel like it has sort of negative associations with it as not being like real or effective, and I think that is really unfortunate because being a full-time graduate in art therapy, it's a rigorous program and you have to pass exams and you have to take all the psych classes and you're a licensed mental health care practitioner. And so I think it kind of has this reputation of, well, I'm not, you know, like that's just making art, or that's just, and so I don't think it really has the same weight as other forms of therapy, which were developed by Western white men. So they have the weight, they have continued to hold on to that weight. Art therapy is also still very white and very Western. Anyway, that didn't answer your question, I guess, because I don't really know.
It did. No, I think it did. I think it did. And especially the idea of art therapy often being offered in sort of in context, in a program, in a school. And I don't know enough about art therapy as a practice to know, you know, if that is sort of inherently part of it, that offering it through a context is really helpful. It seems like it is in a lot of ways.
And I think like some clinicians use art in their practice as clinicians, and I think art therapy is very different from that. Art therapy is really its own field, and there's a lot of research and reading and people who really practice art therapy, and it's very different from clinicians who just use art. Not to say that they can't do that, but that it really is using the creative and the art making and the process at the forefront of the therapy and the healing. You still use therapy techniques, and you still, you know, we still learn all of these mental health counseling techniques and things that you use in more traditional therapy, but it really is with the focus on the art making as healing, art making as expression, art making as sort of the stimulation and the starting point for whatever larger healing is the goal.
That makes total sense. And I'm noticing that we're getting close to time because our conversations always,
we didn't even like, oh my god.
I know.
Well,
I know, but this is what I love so much talking with you, is I just feel like there's so much to explore and so much content, and your willingness and bravery to just sort of always making sure to just say, this is just me and it's just my perspective, but willingness to really go into
And
a subject.
I will say, like, it's not a surprise that 40 minutes have flown by, because we're looking at like a massive
Huge
ocean of water here, and like I'm one tiny little droplet having a conversation. It's a huge topic, art therapy alone, and then trauma, and then COVID and collective trauma and oppressive
Yes.
systematic racism as trauma. I mean, those are all, like, you could have like 1,000 guests for each of those topics on your Facebook
and
Live.
I will. and no, and full on, that is my hope for the comment section of this video, and to bring it full circle, that's my hope for the gallery space to a certain extent. And I think the last question that I want to ask is, just in your opinion, as we do sort of collectively metabolize, we'll just use the pandemic as an example because it is sort of the most collectivized experience we've lived through as human beings. What are some ways that you imagine coming together around art making, whether it's traditional art therapy for someone in a setting, or something that we could host at the gallery in a more sort of welcoming and open and casual thing, but still with that core of seeing art and art making and conversation about art and art making as therapeutic, as we sort of continue to step out of this pandemic and into what will be this next chapter for us that is going to start to diverge again because of all of our experiences. I mean, we've had this collectivization, but that, will start to scattershot again, because we are all different people who are going to experience this in different ways.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think that's a really good question for everyone to continually ask themselves as we start to sort of exit this period. I mean, I know this is not it's not over.
All the caveats.
I think one thing that I've thought a lot about as people talk about going back to normal, or, and for people who have lost members of their family, like, this isn't no one's going back to normal here. And so I think for me, it's sort of like, how do you, okay, let me start over. I think in our culture, or at least my sort of immediate microculture, there's this sort of Band-Aid phenomenon of just like, okay, that's it, cover it up. We'll wait till that heals. Then we take the Band-Aid off. It's new, it's all set. And I think that could be really upsetting for me, that would be upsetting, even in my microculture of my own family, of sort of like, okay, everything's good now, and it's sort of like, well, how do we actually, though? Like, we just lived through a incredible year of unprecedented experiences that each individual person was affected by differently. And also, we as a globe have experienced this. And how do we respond to that? And so I've just sort of been toying with ideas of sort of like, well, what kind of like collective art projects could happen, or how do we use art to kind of respond to things like that? And I am absolutely not the first person to think about that. Obviously, there are collective art projects that have popped up everywhere in response to lots of things. So I think about it just in terms of like my own little community. How can we do that? I think of like murals all over the United States that have popped up in terms of like racial justice, and the impact that has had. The impact that art has is incredible. I always think of Michael Longley, I think his name is. He's like a Irish poet, but I was listening to a podcast or something. And he was talking about, the interviewer asked him, I think it was On Being, maybe, the interviewer asked him like, what's the use of poetry? He was kind of talking about poetry, and he was like, it's useless. Poetry's useless. And I was like, what is this guy saying? Like, and then he was like, but when you think of, any nation that has a dictator or any sort of real oppressive regimes, the first thing that they take away are they burn books and they take away the artists and the poets and the novelists. And he's like, it has value. And it's the value that gives it the use. It's that there's this value that the tapping into this emotional response, the tapping into, I think that we can so easily, because feelings can be difficult to feel.
Yeah.
We can so easily just like, I can't, I do it too. I do it all the time. I'm doing it right now. I'm like, oh, I'm getting emotional talking about that. Like, let's make a joke or let's intellectualize it or and so it's kind of leaning into like, hey, this was a really intense thing. Like, how can we collectively sort of experience it or talk about it or allow ourselves to have feelings about it, and allow a space for that and provide a container for that. I know we're at time, but one last person that I will talk about is Candy Chang. I feel like does collective art projects, and a lot of other artists do also, but she comes to mind with her, I think her current piece is Barricades, Light the Barricade, anyway, you can Google it. I think it's Light the Barricades, but she also did an installation which started on an old like abandoned house that she covered with spray paint, and then just spray painted the words, when I die, I want to, or before I die, I want to, blank. And those started popping up. I'm sure people have heard of that or seen that before. And that came out of her a personal grieving period that she went through after losing someone. And so I think that things and the response to that was overwhelming of people, just, and so it's like, we're all here and we're all having these really intense feelings. And in this sort of transition out of COVID or whatever it is that this is going to look like now, it's like, well, how can we collectively reflect on what happened and how you felt, and can I see you and can you see me, and can we have connection there, and can that be like a healing thing? Or are we just we're good, back at it, no problem, here we go. Obviously those thoughts are all still turning. It's still a work in progress in my mind of what something like that might look like, but I get excited thinking about what we could do with the gallery, or thinking about what could happen at the Mill District or Amherst or in the Valley, of sort of a collective response or some kind of interactive art making, that in a really, the word that comes to mind is gentle. Like, I think we need to be gentle. And so if anybody has any ideas about that or wants to collaborate or is like, hey, I think we should do this, I would love to get like a group of people together to talk about that, or think about what that would look like, or what people would want, or what could we make, really.
I agree. I would love that too. And I think we should. Thank you so much, Arielle, for being willing to come on here and talk with me today about all of this and just be in the thick of it. I also look forward to talking more about projects we can do and space that we can hold at the gallery and in the Mill District, for what you're talking about, these kinds of circles of words and artwork and support. Really
connection and community. That's the name of the game.
It is the community.
I don't know, the game I just made up. What game? I don't know. I'm done. Time's up. I'm off. I don't have to be here. My brain just went like
overload. Yes.
I'm like blushing on Zoom. All right.
Oh, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hannah. My pleasure. I love our chats.
Yes, and we will chat again probably incredibly soon.
Look forward to it.
Bye.
Bye.